Today in the AWS Developers Podcast, we're talking about how Gen AI, generative AI, can help me as a developer. Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for joining the AWS Developers Podcast every Friday in all podcast application, all good podcast application on the web as well. Please subscribe so you can receive the new downloads every Friday morning. A voice that you are used to hear on the podcast, it's Brooke Jamieson, your developer advocate. We are in the same team. Thank you for being here, and you're going to co-host this podcast with our special guest from today, Massimo Refere. You're based in Italy and you're a senior principal product manager in the Amazon Q team. You told me that your Twitter bio says that you're global psychology officer. What does it mean?
Well, thanks for having me. First of all, it's obviously a joke. It's been crafted many years ago against this notion that, technology is important in our world, but I think that the way that the human being behaves when it relates to technology is a very interesting aspect. So I just wanted to create a big joke.
All good jokes are based in truth, Massimo. I think it's at least partially true, which is why a solid proportion of people just believe it at face value, or when people get to work with you, they understand it.
No, absolutely. I can give you, I have a ton of anecdotes about this. Probably the best one is many years ago, maybe 10 years ago, I was talking to a colleague. I was working at a different company, and he came to me and say, "Oh, my customer has decided to adopt OpenStack. They need to figure out why, but that is the decision that they made." And I was like, this doesn't make any sense. So there was a lot of psychology going into that. And over the years, I came across, dozens of, if not hundreds of these anecdotes. But yeah, definitely grounded in truth.
Since a couple of years, you moved to a very cool team within Amazon, the Amazon Q for Developers team. So what is Amazon Q? How it can help me as a developer?
So Amazon Q, let's head back for a second. Amazon Q is our generative AI assistant for work. That's how we talk about Amazon Q. There are many different expertise of Amazon Qs or Amazon Q. One of them is Amazon Q Developer, which, as the name implies, is a generative AI assistant that can help a developer in the entire lifecycle of software development. Right? Of course, this includes coding assistant, but it's not limited to that. We want to make Amazon Q Developer useful to all builders, not just like traditional developers, but all builders that work on application. And by that, I mean they build application, they deploy application, they debug application. That is kind of how we would like to make Q be helpful for builders.
That's important to precise, because there is multiple flavor or capabilities of Amazon Q, and some customers are telling me, hey, everything is called Amazon Q now. So there is Amazon Q in QuickSight for data analysis. There is Amazon Q in Redshift to generate SQL statement. The one we are going to talk about today, it's Amazon Q for developer, the one that sits inside your IDE that can help you on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, exactly. And by the way, it's not just in the IDE, because to be able to support the entire SDLC, software development lifecycle, we need to be in many places. Like the IDE, of course, is a very important one, but we're also in the console, we are in the CLI, we are in Code Catalyst, we are in many places.
Even in the mobile app for the console, which I always forget exists. I always ask people if they use this. I think people use it mostly to look at their billings when they're on the go. But I would love to hear if people are using Amazon Q Developer in their iPhone app.
For the anecdote, I discovered that during a dinner at reInvent, I was sitting next to the console product manager during a dinner, and he told me, "You know that since today you have Amazon Q in your pocket." I said, "Wow!" And I start to play with Amazon Q on the phone during our reInvent.
Yes. There are convenient ways to use Q pretty much everywhere, and we strive to be where the customers are, basically.
Yeah. It seems like it's sprawled out quite a lot since the initial announcement at reInvent last year. What was the initial spark or sort of problem that led to the creation of Amazon Q Developer?
That's an interesting question, because I mean, a lot of people that think about these generative AI products, they think about code generation, right? Inside the IDE, this is where it all started. Actually, for us, and I'm not sure if we talk a lot about this, but actually for us, the sparkle of these was for troubleshooting, right?
Mm-hmm.
One of the places that it was actually two sparkles, I would say. The first one is troubleshooting, where someone came up with this idea that if someone is troubleshooting a problem inside the console, we need to give them like a way to better understand what the problem is and how to resolve it. And these over time evolve into one of these features of Amazon Q, which is the debugging / troubleshooting feature inside selected consoles, where if there is a problem, you get to use Q to troubleshoot that problem. The second sparkle was about these. No, I mean, the industry was not even talking about this notion of agents that would do things in this generative AI coding assistant. But one of the intuition that we had was, which by the way got like to the Amazon Q agent for software development eventually, which is the feature that we have today. The other sparkle that I was mentioning was this notion of, can we assign a task to this assistant? Can we, instead of asking to give me like a brief piece of code versus asking a question, can we assign a task to this assistant so that this assistant can go out and deliver on that task and then coming back? And this was the second sparkle that, as I said, matured over time into what we call today the Amazon Q developer software development feature or agent.
It really rolls off the tongue. It's the Amazon Q developer agent for software development, I think.
Yes. This must be something close to the system manager of managers, something.
It's very
right?
funny.
Yeah, you're competing for the best product name.
Yes. I have to say them all in videos, so I sometimes think your team is trolling me a little bit when we have to shoot quick videos and they have very long names. I'm always excited to see what the next name will be.
Yes. And this is where all the acronyms comes in, right? I think that internally now we're using something like QSD to shorten that, and like Amazon Q developer for software development, it becomes QSD in emails.
Yeah. And in the community, I hear people mostly just saying /dev because that's the command you put into your IDE to use the feature.
Yes.
So
we like to refer to that as well, to /dev, because that's how we invoke it. Yes.
Yeah, so one of the things with this /dev feature, we'll call it, is sort of a conversational coding experience, which is a little bit of departure from previous directions we've seen in things like Code Whisperer. Can you talk me through some of the decisions that have been made behind the scenes in that movement, and maybe even things you've seen out in the market or with customers that have led to that direction?
Yeah, no, that's another great question. And I think that this ties back to this notion of the progression that we're seeing in the industry when it comes to how customers expect to use these tools and what their expectations are in terms of how they become useful. If I picture in my head like what happened in the last 2-3 years specifically in the code development space, so forget about the other part being helpful for the SDLC, troubleshooting, deployment, and these sort of things. If we focus on the coding part, the progression that you see is inline coding suggestion, chat support, and these agents, right, that I was referring to before. Inline suggestion, to your point, is like you live inside the IDE editor, you start typing stuff, and I mean, it's some sort of autocomplete on steroid, right? It gets to write the things that it thinks that you want to write next. Then it came like the chat interface. The chat interface becomes a lot more flexible because then you can start crafting questions around what you want to achieve. And it's also, by the way, useful if you want to explore something that you don't know exactly how to do, right? So the chat becomes useful for that as well. But what we see right now is this ambition of being able to basically tell Q using that slash dev construct that you called out, which is the agent for software development, to say, I don't want to iterate with you, right? I don't want to interact with you to build an entire new feature and having maybe like a 30-turn conversation where I keep asking you things and you keep giving me snippets of code. I want to assign you a task. I want to keep control as much as I want about what you're doing, but I want you to work on the problem on my behalf. And the way that this feature works today, it's an evolving space, but the way that it works today is that you signal what your end goal is, right? The feature that you want to build. My go-to example is I have an application that doesn't have a user interface. It's a very simple application, 5 or 6 APIs that I usually use for my experiment. And I typically ask you when I want to demonstrate this functionality, build me a user interface for this very small application, right? I don't want to interactively build that application. I want you to build that for me. The way that this agent works is that it goes out, it understands my repository, my application, and then it comes back with a plan on how to actually build the piece of code that I asked for, right? In this case, the user interface. And it presents me with a plan. And the good thing about the plan is that it lays out exactly what the queue is going to do to build what I ask. And that is the first point where I keep control, where I can steer the plan. If I see something in the plan that Q came up with that I don't like, I can steer the plan and say, that part, the point number 3, don't do that. I don't need it. Or point number 4, do it differently. I can interact with Q until the point where I feel confident with the plan, at which point I can resubmit it to Q, and Q will go and create this application for me or this feature.
One of the things which is great with that plan is the level of details. I'm always amazed, really surprised by the quality of the plan, and the level of details and the context. It's not only working on one single file, but it understands the different files I have in my project, and it's able to generate modification across multiple files.
Absolutely. And the other thing that surprised me when we launched this feature, because what usually happens is that you launch a feature thinking about customers are using it in a particular way, and then customers use it in a very completely different way. And one of the things that we learn out of this feature is that there are a lot of customers that do not even ask you to build the feature off of the plan. They just want to use the plan, right? They want to use Q as a sounding board, or as someone that they ask, what should I do if I want to build this feature? And then they take that plan, they take that suggestion at that point, and they go and build the feature the way that they have always been building the feature.
I've even heard of managers doing this. Like if you're a new manager and you are working with junior developers for the first time and you want to do a good job, I think it's really confusing when you start being in that sort of a role, because if you just tell a junior developer to build a feature, there's actually heaps of things they have to think about. So yeah, I've heard people getting the plan from Q, because it's very, when you see it in your ID, it's like pretty in depth. There's even like sub points on the different like numbered items. Everything's organized really well. I've seen people using this to help them make sure they're giving good instructions to their team and making sure that they're being a better communicator. And like you said, without even generating the code from that.
Yeah. And another thing that surprised me, given that we are talking about things that surprise us in terms of how customers are using features, I was talking to Nathan Peck a few months ago, and he said, I don't remember if this is something that he was doing or he heard some customers doing this, but what he said is that he was not using Q at that point to ask Q to build like a script or a piece of program for him, but what he was doing the other way around. He would build a script or a piece of program, and he would ask Q, "Am I missing something here? Right? Is this reasonable? Right?" And Q would say, "Well, you're missing like a check here. Maybe if this function spits an error, you're not managing that error." And he would be like, "Oh, right, I forgot to add that." So it's incredibly surprising. It's an incredibly surprising space.
So it's like pair programming with having a fellow developer looking above my shoulder all the time.
That is exactly what it is. Yes.
It's also like a pair audience, sort of like when I do live streams. I always panic because when you're just like doing demo projects for yourself, I personally can be very casual about how I'm doing certain aspects of the code. But when you're doing that for a big audience, you have to be very, very thorough and very specific, because absolutely there will be someone in the comments saying, but what about this thing? So I use QDeveloper just to it's a pair programmer, but also a pair audience, like in terms of pre-guessing the things that people might complain that I've missed there just because I've been too blasé in my development.
So you convince us we want to try that as a developer. Where can I get started?
I would say that as a developer building code, the best way to get started with Amazon Q is in the IDE. There is a specific plugin for the most used IDEs.
So JetBrains, VS Code.
JetBrains, VS Code, Visual Studio. There is a specific Amazon Q plugin. I want to clarify something here for the audience if they get confused. We used to ship Amazon Q as part of the AWS toolkit, and that was until we GA'd the product back in April. When we GA'd the product, Amazon Q, we decided to have a separate plugin. So if you are searching for the plugin in the VS Code JetBrains marketplace, search for the Amazon Q plugin. The second thing that you need to do once you install the plugin in your IDE is to authenticate. There are a couple of ways that you will be authenticated. We split these into enterprise workforce, right? Big organization, and individual developers. If you are an enterprise developer, your organization will have set up like the infrastructure for you to be able to log in into Identity Center. They will have subscribed you to Q. So it's a different world than the individual developer.
So that's for large enterprise where someone like a system admin will typically configure the single sign-on with Okta, Active Directory, and things like that.
Exactly.
But if I'm a hobbyist or I'm an indie developer all by myself, I have an option as well.
You have an option, which is the second option that I was going to describe, which is you need to sign up with Builder ID. If you don't have it, Builder ID is the way that we identify builders at Amazon. It's like literally a few clicks to create a Builder ID account. And with the Builder ID account, you can authenticate into Amazon Q, and you have access to a generous free tier inside Amazon Q to use pretty much, I would say, all the features that would matter for an individual user. The features that you won't be able to use are those that matters more to the enterprise users, like dashboards and these sort of things, which as an individual user you probably don't care. So it boils down to limits in the end. But the inline coding has unlimited access, so you can use inline coding as much as you want. Chat has a limit of 50 conversations per month per Builder ID. But yeah, that's kind of how you get started.
But Builder ID, correct me if I'm wrong, is not necessarily linked to an AWS account. It means I can start to use Amazon Q Developer with just an email address and a Builder ID. I don't need to put out my credit card number and create an AWS account and everything.
Absolutely. You don't need to be an AWS customer. You don't need to have an AWS account. And actually, if you have an AWS account, you cannot even link it to Builder ID today. So we need to work on this part. But yes, to your point, yes, absolutely, you don't need anything.
So that's a super important message. You can start to use Q today without a credit card, without an AWS account, just a valid email address. With the free account, the Builder ID account, you said also there is some limit in terms of usage, but the feature are there. So the /dev feature we were talking about before is available for free with, of course, a limit on usage.
Yeah. Builder ID has 5 prompts, 5 invocation of the /dev features. The enterprise version, the pro version, has 20. So as you can see, the difference is basically on the limits for the most part.
And you can discover all these limits on the documentation. Of course, there is a very nice table, very clear, and the link to that table is in the podcast notes. Just scroll down a bit in your podcast app and click there. You will have all the details.
Exactly.
And if you're using it for work, always check to see if your company has a professional account, because they might, and you just might not have looked at the email about that. So if you want to get access to those features, always check to see, especially if you're using them for work, always check to see if your work has already organized this for you.
It's funny that you mentioned that, because we even have developers inside of Amazon asking us, why can I not use these blah, blah, or why am I hitting this limit? And we figure later that they were using Builder ID.
Right.
Which is like, no, you can use our own instance of Amazon Q. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. There must be, like you said, there's builders inside Amazon using this. Are there any good numbers or stats you can share with us that won't result in a trapdoor opening next to you about things, about how people are using it? Even like we talked about earlier, people using their product in different ways for different things.
Yeah, of course. I mean, there are lots of people using it internally. I think that the most interesting example when it comes to number is what we have also shared a few months ago when we announced the product, where one of these features, a companion of /dev, is /transform, which allows you to transform and upgrade Java application from Java 8 to Java 17. One of the number that we have shared is that a team of 5 people has upgraded 1,000 Java application in 2 days.
Wow!
Okay, so this is like one of the number that we have shared in the past. We are in the process of creating more customer-facing number that shows how we are leveraging and using Q internally, but I mean, that's kind of the scale that you can think about in terms of the productivity.
Yeah, for sure.
We talk about the more advanced feature that are available for enterprise user. You mentioned dashboards, and that reflects how the individual developers are using this code assistant, like how many code suggestions have been accepted, for example, proposed and accepted, so the admin of the enterprise can look at that. One of the features I wrote about recently in a blog post is the ability to customize the models based on my own proprietary code. Can we go a bit deeper into that? How does it work? Why do I want to do that first? And then how does it work?
This is probably the biggest, example that I would use to talk about how the enterprise version is different from the free tier version. Customization. I mean, I'll say what the feature does today, and then I'll talk a little bit more about the direction that we want to take there. I mean, what it does today is It works in the IDE. It only works on the code base. Uh, and basically, what it does is uh, you have a way, a knob to be able to tell Q that there is a different code base from what it learned from publicly available code base that it can use to create suggestion for your uh, coding tasks, right? So if you are a big enterprise customer, most likely you are using like internal libraries, you're using like an internal code base of some sort that you are evolving or building on. You have your own standards about, what to use. And this feature fills that gap because, of course, Amazon Q stock out of the box doesn't know about your private stuff, right? So to it's a way to tell and to teach Amazon Q about that last mile, which is your private repository, so that when Q provides you with suggestion in terms of code that you're writing, it takes into account your own standards, your own code standard. It understands your libraries, it understands your classes, it understands that part. So this is what it does today. But for us, customization is a lot more than what I just described, right? The place where we want to be is that we want Q to be able to learn from you and your organization to be able to provide better assistance across the entire SDLC. The example that I usually use here, which is like kind of another joke, controversial, is that if you ask Q in the console, for example, today, how can I deploy a containerized application? You would expect Q to answer like, oh, there are the 17 ways to deploy a containerized application on AWS, right? Pick one. I'm joking, right? I mean, Q will provide you
Two
a
or
little bit
three.
more. No, a little bit more guidance, but it doesn't know today what your
The
standard is,
context.
right? Because maybe your organization, your big bank, has standardized on, I don't know, EKS and AppRunner, or maybe ECS and Fargate, or maybe whatever, right? So that we want to get to a point where this big organization, when they roll out Q inside the organization, and the developer asks, I have this new application, I need to deploy it. How should I deploy it? It answers with, of course, the knowledge and the best practices that comes with the AWS knowledge that Q has, but also with the hint about what this standard is for this company, right? You just want to use EKS or you just want to use ECS, and this is how you do it.
And where you can get that information by looking at the consumption of services in the console, or through data that are pushed by the AWS account teams like the TAM and the account managers.
It could be in many places. It could be introspecting your account. For example, it could be because you told Q pretty much like today you customize the coding part by providing a code asset. You could tell Q, look at this wiki, right? Or look at this repository of information that describe my standards, right? This is actually where uh, Q developer and Q business kind of starts overlapping a little bit, right? Because today you do these things with Q business, right? Q business is that queue of many, as you pointed out, that you can point to your private documentation and chat with that. So you can expect a word where this queue will start to, not merge maybe, but overlap in terms of functionality. And we may use a piece of Q business to deliver this functionality for Q developer, for example. But customization and personalization means a lot of things to a lot of different people. The other one is I also want to know who you are, right? So if you are a Python developer, right, and you ask me being Q, uh, give me a piece of code to do X, Y, Z. I mean, I want to know that you are a Python developer, so the snippet of code that I'm giving you is in Python instead of Scala or Ruby or Java or whatever, right? So I think that there is a ton of work that we need to do here. We are just scratching the surface of what's possible. But that's kind of the direction that we're taking.
So just to be clear, what you're talking about right now, it's the aspiration is the roadmap.
It's future.
Right now, customization, it's on code base. And where should my code be? Like you give you point Q to a Git repo on-prem or in the cloud, and it will customize, fine-tune a model, or maybe we don't even talk about what type of customization technology we are applying there, but it will learn from my code, from the source code.
Exactly. Just as you said, we point to an external repository. Off the top of my head, it could be GitHub, it could be S3. I think Brooke is the expert. Because she has been demoing these a lot of times.
But the demos are the hardest part. Okay, so I have a photo which doesn't help because this is an audio medium, so I will describe it. This is a photo of Massimo backstage getting his makeup done for the Next Generation Builder Experience session at reInvent last year. But so, like, I was there doing the demo.
I'm glad that this is voice only.
It's so good. It's so good. He looks so serene and relaxed, everyone who's listening. He's got a little cape on. He's getting his makeup done. It's incredible. But the hardest part of that session was doing the demo because, like, you need a lot of code to demo customizations because it needs to understand all the strange and eccentric parts of your code base. However, I don't have code that is like strange enough and large enough that I can immediately demo this with. And it's one of the most frustrating things about this because I've seen people use this in enterprise and I know they get great results. But for me to demo something on stage, I have to essentially make really strange toy code, or I have to, it's really hard to write a lot of like incorrect code as well if you're trying to do different things. So it's one of those features that works when you're an enterprise, but it is so difficult to demo because it's like all the moving pieces you need behind the scenes. And then as well, even if I had a big strange repo, I can't share them publicly. So it's very difficult. And I would really encourage people to get out there and try that customizations feature because then you'll get the cool pieces. Like it'll understand the nuance behind the classes you're using, the libraries you're using. One of my friends works in finance and like at a hedge fund, and they have very, very, very specific code that they use. And I just know it would be perfect for this, but obviously I'm not going to show that on stage at reInvent. So like think about different parts of your code and also think about it as like if you have code that's really difficult to onboard new developers to, something like this is going to help you because then obviously there are some eccentricities in your code base that are quite unusual. And this is going to give you the best shot at being able to work with that. So have a try and let us know how it goes for you.
Is there a minimum amount of code to provide to Q to make that feature relevant? Like, is it in the tens of megabytes, hundreds of megabytes, gigabyte?
I think last time I checked, it was 10 megabytes, but I'll need to fact check myself on this. The thing is like that doesn't sound like a lot if you're thinking of like an image file that's 10 megabytes. It's not that much, but of straight code, that is a lot if you are me trying to do this at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. So I think for a regular company, it won't be that much of a big lift. It's just like when you're doing something for a demo. It's this weird like situation that only exists when you're demoing new products that are meant for enterprise when you are not an enterprise as a single person.
And one of the key activities when customizing models like that is to benchmark them, to evaluate them. So are we providing tools to system administrator to evaluate different versions of the models they produce, they customize, to tell, okay, this one is better than that one. I will expose this one to this group of developers.
We do have the seed of a better support for these. So one of the things that we do when you customize these with these additional private code base is that we tell you immediately a feeling of how good this customization is, right? It's a metric, it's a number that we spit at the end of the customization where Q is going to tell you, what you have just done is going to work pretty well versus it's going to be really stopping with, requests for this particular code base. And that depends on, how much information it got from like these private repo, the size, the quality in general, right? It's a synthetic number. We do not do what you were suggesting, like comparing like, a couple of different type of customization. We don't do that today, but definitely this is something that we're looking at across, the board, making it more useful, making it more, measurable for sure.
Yeah. And even when you're setting it up, one of the things that can change your score is like if you have lots of repeated files in the code base, or if you have lots of auto-generated files that are taking up, like they're getting you to that minimum limit, but they're not adding any value. So it's partially a look at how well the customization's doing, but it's also partially a look at the information that you're giving to set it up for success. And do you have enough information? Is it from enough languages that you're using? Things like that.
Yes, the other problem here, because we were talking about demos and struggling with demos, reminded me that, the variability of how generative AI works throws usually like a big curveball into all of this discussion, right? The anecdote, or not the anecdote, but the scenario that usually I use to describe this challenge is we come from a world where we have a number of workshops out there that are based pretty much on this notion of infrastructure as code, right? So you have like step-by-step scenarios where you test new products and new things and you demo stuff using infrastructure as code. And you go back 4 years later and that infrastructure as code just runs the same as 4 years before, right? When you start using generative AI, you need to get into this new Zen mode of thinking that, that is the past. Right? I don't like it, but it is the way it is, right? So you get a lot more variability into this. So even creating workshop, let alone demos, creating workshop and these sort of things that typically requires like, step 1, this is the output. Step 2, this is the output. Step 3, this is the output. If you get a different output in step 1, what do you do? Right. So there is a lot of challenges around this.
As a developer advocate writing a lot of demo, I was quite frustrated at the beginning of the year with exactly what you explained. However, where Amazon Q code suggestion shines for me is when I forgot it's there. I open my VS Code, I start to work on something, and it happens no later than this morning. I was editing a shell script, a plain old boring shell script in Bash, and suddenly it suggests me like 3 lines of code, exactly what I need at the right time, at the right moment. It is, oh yes, it still started this thing there, and it pops up in front of me and helps me to be a more productive.
Yeah. When I talk to developers about these cool features, I also really wanted to talk about the next immediate follow-up question that they asked us. So can you, Massimo, talk us through how this handles security? So I'm not talking about the security scans that Amazon Q Developer can do on your code to check for security vulnerability. I want to talk about security and data protection of customer data across Amazon Q Developer.
Yeah. So first of all, I like that you said data. Or data,
Massimo got me to do demos of this specifically, and he wanted me to say the word data in there because of my thick North Queensland accent.
This is definitely a fabricated question to achieve that goal. Thank you.
If we recorded this podcast and I did not say data one time, you would have been upset. So
absolutely. Of course, this is top of mind for us, right? This is like, security is job zero for AWS, and we care a lot about, earning trust with customers for these. So our policy is that we host data in the US because Amazon Q is only available in the US. So from an infrastructure perspective, that is what we do today. Of course, we have planned to come to other regions, can share data or numbers, but that's kind of one of the asks from particularly highly regulated customers to be available in the region where they operate. So there is that aspect. The other aspect is how we use those data, and the short answer is that we don't use that data or those data, right? So the policy, the long story short is that for the paying customers, we default to not being able to see anything, right? And by the way, I'll say this is a big struggle for us, right? It is a big struggle for us because if we do not see what the customers are doing and we don't, it's going to be very difficult to improve the system without having that input, right? Or that knowledge about how our customers using our product, right? But we're not compromising on that. It would be breaking the trust with the customers if we do that. This is for paying user. For non-paying users, so go back to the individual user builder ID that we were discussing before, we default to be able to see the prompts from the customer and what the customer is doing, but there is an opt-out option, right? So if you are an individual user, you can opt out and basically not allowing us to see anything.
Just to be clear, it's opt-in by default. You need to opt out for that.
Yes.
For the individual free customers.
For the individual is opt-in by default, so they allow us to see the prompt and the answers, but you can opt out. You can say, I don't want you to see what I'm doing. Yes, correct. And for the enterprise, is opt-out by default.
Yeah.
I think that you could opt-in. I don't think that anybody wants to do that.
Yeah, my caveat to this is always, if you would like to share your product feedback in an abstract way, this is what developer advocates are for. Also, I'm sure you can just DM Massimo, he would accept it. But this is what developer advocates are for. Like this is our whole job. We talk to people, we're the middle people between AWS and the customers. So if there's something specific that it's behaving strangely and you want to make it better, or you want to explain the issue to us in a way that doesn't compromise on your security, that's what we're here for. So get in touch with me or Seb or any of my myriad of colleagues. This is what we're here for, and we can help you to pass that along to the product team. Massimo gets all sorts of DMs from me with screenshots of like Twitch comments I get, or on LinkedIn even. So, and the team loves it. Like we really do forward this along, and it really does get used. So even if you're opted out and you would like to stay opted out, but you would still like to opt into personal feedback, this is what developer advocates are for. We have lots of this feedback, right? So Massimo, do you have any examples of feedback you've received that has changed the product direction of Amazon Q Developer, or are you excited about maybe bringing in some of this feedback in some of your roadmap items for pieces coming up next?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that part of this interesting feedback is hearing how customers are using our products, right? So I think that this notion of the example that I used before, customers using the /dev capability to just use the plan is forming like a new way of thinking about this feature, right? Where we are thinking about maybe there is a way to split this feature, right? And I'm thinking like, very transparently here in terms of how we are thinking about the product internally, where today it's mostly like a black box, right? It's a sequence that you cannot touch. Like, for example, you ask Q what you want to do, Q presents a plan, maybe you can see the plan, and then it executes the plan. What we're thinking about, can we split this, right? Can we split these into like a very specific workflow that just give me the plan of the how to do this, right? And then another part of the product that takes this plan and build what you're doing. And one of the advantages of splitting this is that then you can bring your plan, right? So instead of asking Q to build the plan, maybe you specialize in building plans, right? So think about like a partner that specializes in building plans for Amazon Q to execute for a particular workflow, a migration or whatever that is, right? So I think that observing how people are actually using our products is a very inspiring way to form the next generation of the workflows.
So obviously we're working with customers since quite a few months, more than a year now, on this service, on this product. Have you observed some good patterns, habits that customer adopted to be successful, to be more productive with Amazon Q Developer?
Yeah, I think that, of course, the quality of the product plays a big role in terms of how successfully customers and users have been using it versus not. But I think that what I have observed talking to a lot of customers with different feedback is that expectations matter a lot, right? I used to say many months ago, I used to say that when you think about this generative AI assistant Q or whatever, right? It's like you can rent a car and you can drive into a wall or you can go to a beach, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's extremely easy to drive a car into a wall, right? But why would you want to do that just to go on Twitter to say, oh, look, the car got crashed into a wall, right? I would rather to use a car to go to the beach. This is what I was saying a few months ago, and I kept saying this. Yesterday, we released this new benchmark on the SWE bench, where basically it's a benchmark that shows how effective the /dev agent is, right? So basically, the idea is that there are more than 1,000 repository with issues, and you give these issues to Amazon Q or a generative AI assistant, and this benchmark tracks how many issues you were able to close with that assistant, or how many issues were closed by that assistant. I think that today we're at the top, or we're in the lead with 20% of issues being closed. Now, there are two ways to look at this. The first way is,
Only?
Oh gosh, it got 80% wrong. This thing doesn't work, right? The other way to look at this is, 20%. I can take all Fridays off from now until I retire, right? You need to set expectations about how useful these assistants are today and in the future. You can expect in the future that 20% to grow to 25, 30, 35, 40, whatever, right? But even where it is today, it can be helpful to remove some of the toil and the undifferentiated heavy lifting that you are dealing with today with your daily task, whether it's coding, whether it's planning, whether it's discovering services, whether it's troubleshooting. It doesn't always get it right, but it could be useful.
And that's exactly the experience I have as well. When I expect something very precise, I'm always a bit disappointed. But as I mentioned earlier, it's when we forgot about it, or we just take whatever is coming. And 80% of the code done for me, that's already a lot. Exactly. I can use that time to do something else.
Think about this. If you get 80% of the code right, you can only work on Mondays to fix that 20%, and that's it. I'm joking, of course.
If only the job of developer was only to write code.
Yes,
that would be totally correct, indeed. I know we are not talking about the roadmaps and in details at least, but Brooke also asked the question about the direction. We start to talk about feedback and tips and best practices, but where are we going with this type of tools, us and maybe the industry in general?
Yeah, I think that I touch on some of the direction that we want to take for customization, for example. That's kind of a good chunk of how our thinking. The other big one for me specifically, and I'm trying to convince the team to invest more into this, is this notion of we seem to be stuck into these I call it English to code, right? Mm-hmm. So I prompt something and I want code out of it. What I've seen also customers being incredibly interested in, and what I've seen customers being successful using these assistants is what I refer to code to English, like taking a piece of code as an input and helping someone describing what this piece of code does, right? A lot of customers are telling us that onboarding new people to project is very time consuming because it takes them days, weeks to come up to speed with an existing code base and relate to them, and then started to be productive to fix problem, expanding capabilities and things like that. If you had a product, if you had an assistant that would be able to help you decoding, literally decoding what that code does and explaining where things are and where things are happening inside the code base. That is an area where we are looking into to be able to be helpful to customers as well. So more, my mantra right now is more code to English than English to code. Yeah.
English and maybe other language as well, because we are from two different continents in this episode of the podcast, with Italian, with French, and that's
when
important.
When will it do an
well.
Australian version? Like, I want to use the workspace functionality to get me a GitHub repo, and then it's like Struth. Or like, g'day, this is a GitHub repo about, like, I just want it to be a thick Australian accent, Massimo. I think we can figure this out.
I would love it.
Voice to code. Massimo Referre, your Senior Principal Product Manager in the Amazon Q team. Thank you for having answered our question with a lot of clarity. I hope we give you desire, we inspire you to try to go to your IDE marketplace today and download the Amazon Q extension. You just need an email address to get started, no credit card. Thank you, Brooke. Thank you for having listened to this episode until the end. See you next week in another episode of the AWS Developers Podcast, but now go build with Amazon Q.